Give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money.
My long-standing distaste for quote-unquote mature animation is well documented at this point and remains a point of contention among my, let's say, colleagues, because the word I'm thinking of is a touch too cruel. After abandoning Star vs. the Forces of Evil due to the sheer exhausting burnout of this pathetic and insecure horse shit, it's probably time I talk about why this trend and consistent 180 of tone is so overwhelmingly destructive and why it gets so much undeserved praise in the first place. You'll probably remember in Guiding Key, I talked about how fans of shows like Teen Titans and The Last Airbender seem to only remember the serious and heavy moments of those shows, even though that was only about 10% of the actual content that aired. The fact that these shows are comedies at the end of the day is often forgotten, along with the fact that the serious moments only stood out because they were contrasted against said comedy. This has been a consistent problem over the years when it comes to discourse regarding, well, anything. Being critically undiscerning doesn't just mean you'll refuse to acknowledge when something is bad, it also means you'll often be blind to the reasons it was good as well, plucking out superficial qualities and assuming that was the reason they succeeded and demanding that other works follow suit. That misattribution of quality is how we found ourselves in this mess, because many of the people who incorrectly read Teen Titans and The Last Airbender in 2003 are now creators themselves 15 years later, Rebecca Sugar and Darren Nefsey specifically, who were new faces to the world of TV animation. One of the big reasons that Friendship is Magic, the show that kicked off this animation renaissance, has avoided this downward spiral into drama is because it's not made by newcomers who grew up with 90s cartoons. It's made by the people who made the 90s cartoons these people grew up with, industry veterans who know better. Teen Titans Go is made by many of the same people as the original Teen Titans, and what makes its hatred from hardcore fans so ironic is that Teen Titans Go is more accurate to what Teen Titans actually was than die-hard fans' very selective memory of it. It's just that Teen Titans Go doesn't have all the very serious episodes the original had. All 12 of them, only 3 of which were any good. Teen Titans Go, in fact, actively mocks the warped priorities of its older fans.
If I can't trust you with my juice, then maybe I can't trust you at all!
Well, that makes 2 of us. Trust is a two-way street, hombre!
Hey, break it up! It was just juice. Easy for you to say! It wasn't your juice!
But in this age where people nostalgic for the 90s are now the ones creating content, we're seeing an increasingly aggressive push towards serious stories simply for the sake of being serious. This concept has a name, Cerebus Syndrome, named after the comic book series Cerebus the Aardvark, which began as a parody of swords and sorcery fantasy tropes, but over its 27-year run took an increasingly dark and dramatic tone as the creator started to believe his own hype. Cerebus isn't the only comic to become known for this. The comic book series Bone also got more serious as time went on, but like Kingdom Hearts, the effect was blunted by the premise, character setting, and overall design being very unapologetically stupid, and the creator making no attempt to reverse that. Cerebus Syndrome almost always ends up as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you'll have people who like the comedy getting increasingly alienated, and on the other hand, you'll have the people who hate comedy and wanted to die a grisly death applauding you for abandoning it and being totally mature. No, really, stop laughing, Mom. It's no surprise that this trend for long-running comics has leaked into TV animation as well. The big issue I have with Cerebus Syndrome is that it's always presented as a bait and switch. It's not a work that remains consistent in tone while occasionally raising the stakes. It's always something that starts out silly and lighthearted, getting a grimdark upgrade within the first season. It's teasing people with SpongeBob and then slamming the trap down, yelling, "Fooled you, it's Watership Down!" If you want to make a serio comedy, then make a serio comedy from the get-go. Don't get more serious as time goes on, just start out that way so people aren't misled and inevitably burned. Gravity Falls did that, and that's why I never touched it. It was upfront about what it wanted to be right from the very first episode, and I, being someone who doesn't like watching TV dramas, knew not to bother with it. Starting out as one type of show and then turning a 180 partway through is just the creator being a dick. Just make your terrible ideas apparent in the first episode and save the rest of us a lot of otherwise wasted time. I've railed against Cerebus Syndrome for as long as I've been doing this job. It actively makes cartoons worse and saps away their enjoyment, and whenever I do, someone always pipes up this little turd pretending to be an argument. We're not talking about how cartoons shouldn't be for kids, but that they shouldn't be only for kids. This is the favorite talking point from the perpetually insecure dipshits who keep begging for serialization, serious plot lines, grim tones, and washed out color grading to be added to everything. The problem with the presumption that cartoons are viewed as being only for children is that nobody actually believes that, and it's never been a truism in the industry. The kind of cartoons that are only for kids are things like Handy Manny or Paw Patrol or Dora the Explorer, stuff made for really, really little kids. But everything else, Disney, Pixar, The Last Airbender, much of the animation Golden Age, and much of the animation Silver Age, They don't fit in that box. They're colloquially referred to as kids shows, but they've always been more geared in a fun-for-all-the-family mentality. Very few people view these as being only for children. In fact, the only people who do believe that are the occasional Oscar voter and the people who keep demanding that there be more adult animation. You are the only ones perpetuating a stigma that otherwise wouldn't exist. Something interesting to note is that if someone dares call Friendship is Magic a children's show, some terminally insecure asshole will pipe up with, "It's a family show," and revealing just how touchy they are to a show they like being called a children's show. Like how back in the 90s people used to insist that their dolls weren't dolls, they were action figures, and failing to recognize that this is a distinction without a difference. Now you might be asking, why is this important? Well, I've always attributed this mindset to insecurity, a reality that dates all the way back to the comics industry. With the onset of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, a lot of comic books immediately turned almost gruesomely dark because the mainstream media jumped onto these two books as the shocking truth that comics aren't just for kids anymore. And a lot of technically adult fans felt there wasn't any shame in being obsessed with Batman anymore now that Batman had become an unenjoyable monster. But you remember the one really interesting part about that era of comics? These super dark, violent, edgy comics completely fell out of the collective memory because they were fucking awful. Even to this day, it's only the works of Alan Moore and Frank Miller that are still remembered. And that's because all these dark superhero comics were made to capitalize on insecure fans needing reassurance that they're not pathetic for liking children's characters. They existed only to be an entry on the list of reasons comics can be for adults. Alan Moore and Frank Miller wrote actual books. Watchmen, The Killing Joke, The Dark Knight Returns, and all the other ones I was too lazy to read had a lot of really complicated themes in them that deconstruct comics as a whole. The entire point of Watchmen was that if superheroes existed in anything remotely realistic, the entire world would go to shit because you can't trust most people with their own financial autonomy, let alone superpowers. And the entire point of The Dark Knight Returns was that a rich man in a Halloween costume who beats up the poor because he misses his mommy is kind of fucked up, an idea that was casually ignored for many years because it relied on applying realistic logic to a superhero that is overwhelmingly campy and silly. Batman should have never been redesigned to take this concept at face value.
Why did you say that name?
When you apply realistic logic to it, the 10 Plagues of Egypt paint God as a petty and vindictive nutcase using his omnipotent powers in such destructive and counterproductive ways for no other reason than because he feels like it and just because he can. But just because I can make that reading doesn't mean the entire Bible should be rewritten from a misotheistic point of view. That would be stupid. These gritty comics that everyone fawns over had a lot of things to say about superheroes and the implications their existence and actions create, even in works where they are portrayed as universally good. But because interpreting those kind of themes takes the slightest amount of effort, guess what most people did? They didn't put in the effort and just assumed that they were good because they were violent and gritty and dramatic. But the fact that these comics were dark was not their appeal. It was a means to an end. There are very few instances where something needs to be dark, but deconstruction is one of those instances. Knights of the Old Republic 2 is a brutally dark and cynical game explicitly because it's deconstructing everything that Star Wars is. And it was amazing because it was written by someone who actually gave a shit about making something good. These are creators who want to tell a story and use the tools they need when they need them. On the flip side, people who write stories not because they want to tell them, but because they want to prove a point often never make anything worth remembering to prove that point. Think about how every few years someone tries to bring back traditional animation by slapping together a film and praying it succeeds. But because all they care about is bringing back traditional animation, they completely neglect all the other things necessary to make a movie, especially the writing, the single most important part of any movie, animated or not. In fact, in an animated movie, the animation is the least of your worries. And this carries through to the obsession with proving that animation isn't only for kids. This premise doesn't need proving because Pixar has spent their entire career doing that by taking a premise that's pitched right at the sensibilities of kids and presenting it with a level of respect and intellectual maturity that an adult audience can find engaging as well. By contrast, look at Borrowed Time, a short made by ex-Pixar animators who admitted to making it to prove that animation can be for adults. Surprising absolutely nobody, Borrowed Time is a needlessly grim and miserable short that uses imagery of manslaughter and suicide to push a needlessly grim tone for really no reason. Borrowed Time wasn't made to be an engaging short, it was made to stroke the insecurities of a very small subset of people, and you could have easily achieved the same result with far less money if you just get over yourself and pull the stick out of your ass. If your biggest measure of quality is how well something disproves a stigma that only exists in your berserk goddamn mind, then you have no quality standards, period, and you need to fuck off because you will ruin everything you touch. Dark and gritty drama is a means to an end. Unless you have something to say, you have no business touching it. To summarize, Adam West is what Batman should always be, Tangled was better when it was about a precious babu being a precious babu, and Star vs. the Forces of Evil needs to stop pretending it has something to say about racism while it continues to use actual monsters as stand-ins for minorities when the original cast was already a Hispanic family living in the United States. There might be an overlap between works for kids and works for adults, but these are shows about magical princesses fighting monsters with magic hair and narwhal lasers respectively. Will you keep your dicks in your pants for 5 fucking minutes? And people say I'm the one who needs to be reminded that these are children's shows.